Picture this. You walk into work on a Tuesday morning, expecting another ordinary day at the office. Instead, you're blindsided by HR demanding you accept a 70% pay cut or pack your bags. That's exactly what happened to me at TechFlow Solutions in Austin, Texas. But here's the thing about corporate bullies. They always underestimate the quiet ones. By the time I was done with them, their entire executive team was out of jobs, and I had enough evidence to expose their illegal practices to the world. This is the story of how one phone call brought down a multi-million-dollar company. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been a software engineer for 12 years. I'm not the type to rock the boat. I keep my head down, write clean code, and deliver projects on time. That's exactly why what happened at TechFlow Solutions caught me so off guard. I joined TechFlow in January 2023 as a senior back-end engineer. The company specialized in developing custom software solutions for mid-sized businesses, and on paper, everything looked legitimate. They had impressive client testimonials, a sleek downtown Austin office, and they offered me a competitive salary of $125,000 annually. The hiring process was smooth, and my direct manager, Sarah Rodriguez, seemed knowledgeable and supportive. For the first 6 months, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. I was working on interesting projects, collaborating with a talented team, and learning new technologies. The company culture appeared progressive. They had flexible work arrangements, decent benefits, and regular team-building events. I even recommended TechFlow to a few colleagues who were job hunting. The red flags started appearing in July 2023, but they were subtle at first. I noticed that several long-term employees had suddenly left the company. When I asked Sarah about it, she gave vague answers about restructuring and new directions. The departures seemed odd because these weren't underperformers. They were some of the most skilled developers on the team. Around the same time, I started noticing discrepancies in how the company handled client billing. As a senior engineer, I had access to project management systems where I could see time tracking and billing information. What I discovered was deeply troubling. TechFlow was consistently overbilling clients for work that was either incomplete or had been largely automated. For example, we had a client paying $50,000 for a custom inventory management system, but in reality, we were using a slightly modified version of an open-source solution that took maybe 40 hours to implement. I initially assumed this was just poor project management or miscommunication between departments. I'd seen similar issues at previous companies, and usually, they got resolved once someone brought them to management's attention. So I decided to document what I was seeing and eventually bring it up with Sarah. But before I could have that conversation, something else happened that made me realize the billing issues weren't accidents. I was assigned to work on a project for a healthcare startup called Medicore. The project involved building a patient data management system, which meant we were handling sensitive medical information. During the development process, I discovered that TechFlow was storing patient data on unsecured servers and wasn't following basic HIPAA compliance protocols. This wasn't just bad practice, it was illegal. Medical data requires specific security measures, encryption standards, and access controls. TechFlow was treating it like any other business data, storing it in plain text databases with minimal security. When I brought this to Sarah's attention, her response was dismissive. She told me not to worry about it, and that the compliance team would handle any necessary adjustments later. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong with this company. You don't casually ignore HIPAA violations. That's the kind of mistake that can result in millions of dollars in fines and criminal charges. But Sarah's reaction suggested that this wasn't incompetence. It was a deliberate decision to cut corners and maximize profits. I started paying closer attention to everything happening around the office. I noticed that the executive team, CEO Daniel Morrison, CFO Rebecca Walsh, and Head of Operations Tyler Brooks, were often in closed-door meetings. The company was landing new clients at an impressive rate, but the development team wasn't growing proportionally. We were being asked to take on more projects without additional resources, which explained why quality was suffering. I also started connecting with some of the employees who had recently left the company. Through LinkedIn and informal conversations, I learned that several of them had been pushed out after raising concerns about the company's practices. One former colleague, Jennifer Martinez, told me she'd been terminated just 2 weeks after questioning a billing discrepancy she'd discovered. Another, David Kim, said he'd been forced to resign after refusing to implement a feature that would have violated user privacy regulations. The pattern was becoming clear. TechFlow Solutions wasn't just cutting corners, they were systematically engaging in fraudulent billing practices and ignoring legal compliance requirements. Anyone who tried to speak up was being silenced through termination or forced resignation. By September 2023, I had documented dozens of instances of overbilling, multiple HIPAA violations, and several cases where we were delivering substandard work while charging premium prices. I had screenshots of billing records, email chains discussing how to justify inflated costs to clients, and even recordings of meetings where executives explicitly discussed ways to maximize profit margins regardless of legal requirements. I was in a difficult position. I needed my job. I had a mortgage, student loans, and other financial obligations. But I also couldn't continue being complicit in what was clearly systematic fraud. I decided to try the internal route first, hoping that bringing these issues to the attention of upper management might lead to changes. That decision would prove to be a critical mistake. I requested a meeting with Rebecca Walsh, the CFO, figuring that billing irregularities would fall under her purview. The meeting was scheduled for October 15, 2023, at 2 p.m. in the main conference room. I prepared a detailed presentation outlining the billing discrepancies I'd discovered, complete with specific examples and supporting documentation. Rebecca arrived 10 minutes late, accompanied by Tyler Brooks and someone I didn't recognize, a stern-looking woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Linda Patterson from the legal department. I should have recognized this as a warning sign, but I pressed forward with my presentation. I started with the smaller issues. Instances where we'd billed clients for more hours than were actually worked, or cases where we'd charged for custom development when we'd used existing templates. Rebecca listened politely, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but her demeanor was cold and professional. When I moved on to the more serious issues, the HIPAA violations, the substandard deliverables, the systematic overbilling, the atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Tyler started taking notes, and Linda was typing rapidly on her laptop. Rebecca's questions became more pointed, focusing not on the problems I was identifying, but on how I had access to the information and what I planned to do with it. The meeting lasted about an hour, and by the end, I felt like I was being interrogated rather than heard. Rebecca thanked me for bringing these concerns to their attention and assured me that the company would investigate and address any legitimate issues. She asked me to provide copies of all the documentation I'd gathered, which I did, thinking it would help expedite the resolution process. That was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I noticed that my access to several internal systems had been revoked. When I asked Sarah about it, she said it was part of a routine security update and that my access would be restored soon. But Friday came and went without any restoration of access, and I started getting a sinking feeling that I'd made a serious error in judgment. The following Monday, October 23, 2023, I arrived at the office to find an email from HR requesting an immediate meeting. The email was from someone I'd never heard of, Patricia Nguyen, Senior HR Manager. I'd been at the company for nearly 10 months and had never encountered Patricia before, which suggested she might be a recent hire or someone brought in specifically to handle sensitive situations. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in HR's office on the 3rd floor. I arrived a few minutes early and was directed to a small conference room where Patricia was waiting along with Linda Patterson, the legal representative from my previous meeting. This time, I knew I was walking into an ambush. Patricia was in her early 40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of professional smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She started the meeting by thanking me for my dedication to the company and my commitment to maintaining high standards. Then she dropped the bombshell. "Marcus, we've completed our review of the concerns you raised last week. While we appreciate your diligence in bringing these matters to our attention, we've determined that your interpretation of certain company practices reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of our business model and industry standards." She went on to explain that what I had identified as billing irregularities were actually standard practices in the software development industry. The HIPAA violations I'd documented were, according to her, misinterpretations of compliance requirements. Everything I'd brought to their attention was being dismissed as inexperience or confusion on my part. But then came the real purpose of the meeting. Given the nature of these misunderstandings, and considering the potential impact on team morale and client relationships, we feel it's necessary to restructure your role within the organization. We're prepared to offer you a position as a junior developer, which would involve a salary adjustment to $37,500 annually. This role would be more appropriate for someone still learning the nuances of enterprise software development. I sat there, in stunned silence as the implications sank in. They were offering me a 70% pay cut and a demotion to a junior position, essentially pushing me out while maintaining plausible deniability. If I refused, they'd have grounds to terminate me for insubordination or failure to accept reasonable accommodation. Patricia continued, "We understand this is a significant change, but we believe it's in everyone's best interest. This new role would allow you to learn from more experienced developers and gain a better understanding of industry practices. We need your decision by the end of the week." Linda Patterson, who had been silent until now, added, "We should also mention that accepting this new position would require you to sign an updated employment agreement, including expanded confidentiality clauses and a non-compete agreement. These are standard protections for the company and our clients." The message was crystal clear. Take the demotion and pay cut, sign agreements that would prevent me from speaking about what I'd discovered, or leave the company entirely. They were betting that I'd either accept their offer out of desperation or leave quietly to avoid a protracted legal battle. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. As I walked back to my desk, my mind was racing. I had until Friday to make a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my career. But as I sat in my cubicle, staring at the computer screen, I realized that TechFlow Solutions had made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed I was just another employee who would quietly accept their bullying tactics. They didn't realize that my documentation efforts had been far more comprehensive than they understood. And they definitely didn't know about the phone call I was about to make. The call that would change everything. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. But instead of dwelling on the impossible choice TechFlow had given me, I did something they never expected. I started making calls. The first call was to my college roommate, Jake Sullivan. Jake worked as an investigative journalist for the Austin Business Journal, and over the years, he developed a network of contacts in law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and corporate whistleblowing organizations. When I explained my situation, Jake's response was immediate and decisive. "Marcus, what you're describing isn't just corporate misconduct. This is federal crime territory. HIPAA violations alone can result in criminal charges, and if they're systematically defrauding clients, we're talking about wire fraud, mail fraud, potentially racketeering if this goes deep enough." Jake connected me with Amanda Foster, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud cases. Amanda had spent 15 years with the Bureau's white-collar crime division before starting her own consulting firm. Her reputation for building airtight cases against corrupt corporations was legendary in Texas legal circles. The next morning, I met Amanda at a coffee shop downtown, far from TechFlow's office. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s, with the kind of direct manner that comes from years of dealing with corporate criminals. I handed her copies of all my documentation, the billing records, email chains, screenshots of HIPAA violations, and recordings of meetings where executives discussed cutting corners. Amanda spent 2 hours reviewing everything, occasionally asking pointed questions about specific incidents or requesting clarification on technical details. Finally, she looked up from the papers and gave me a smile that made my stomach drop. "Marcus, you've just handed me evidence of one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud schemes I've seen in years. This isn't some small-time billing irregularity. TechFlow is running a systematic operation designed to defraud clients while violating federal regulations. The HIPAA violations alone could result in millions in fines, but the billing fraud extends far beyond what you've documented here." She explained that my evidence revealed patterns consistent with much larger criminal enterprises. The systematic overbilling, the deliberate HIPAA violations, the intimidation of employees who raised concerns. These weren't isolated incidents, but components of a carefully orchestrated scheme. "Here's what we're going to do," Amanda continued. "First, you're not going to accept their offer or resign. You're going to string them along while we build a comprehensive case. Second, we're going to expand this investigation beyond what you've already documented. I have contacts at the Department of Health and Human Services, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the Texas Attorney General's office. This case is going to require a coordinated response." Amanda's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of reacting defensively to TechFlow's ultimatum, we were going to use the time they'd given me to gather even more evidence while alerting the appropriate authorities. The key was to act quickly before the company could destroy evidence or intimidate additional witnesses. That afternoon, Amanda made a series of phone calls that would prove to be TechFlow's undoing. The first was to Special Agent Cristina Rodriguez at the FBI's Austin field office. Agent Rodriguez specialized in healthcare fraud and had been looking for a case that would demonstrate the growing problem of tech companies mishandling medical data. The second call was to Michael Chen at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. Michael's team was responsible for investigating HIPAA violations and had been tracking patterns of non-compliance among software companies handling medical data. The third call was to the Texas Attorney General's office, specifically to Assistant Attorney General Lisa Martinez, who headed the Consumer Protection Division. Lisa's team had been building cases against companies engaged in deceptive business practices, and TechFlow's systematic client fraud fit perfectly into their ongoing investigations. By the end of that day, TechFlow Solutions was under investigation by 3 separate federal and state agencies, and they had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, I had to play my role perfectly. On Wednesday morning, I walked into Patricia's office and told her I needed more time to consider the offer. I explained that accepting such a significant pay cut would require me to restructure my personal finances and possibly find a second job. Patricia seemed pleased by my apparent desperation and granted me an extension until the following Monday. What she didn't know was that I was wearing a wire provided by the FBI. Agent Rodriguez had obtained authorization for electronic surveillance, based on the evidence I'd provided, and every conversation I had with TechFlow management was being recorded and analyzed by federal investigators. The extension gave Amanda and her team time to dig deeper into TechFlow's operations. Using the client information I'd provided, they began conducting discreet interviews with companies that had contracted with TechFlow for software development. What they discovered was staggering. Medicor, the healthcare startup whose patient data had been mishandled, was horrified to learn about the HIPAA violations. Their CEO, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, immediately hired an independent security firm to audit their data systems. The audit revealed that TechFlow had not only failed to implement proper security measures, but had also granted unauthorized access to patient records to multiple employees who had no legitimate need for the information. Another client, a financial services company called Lone Star Capital, discovered that the custom trading platform they'd paid $200,000 for was actually a slightly modified version of an open-source trading system available for free online. The modifications TechFlow had made were cosmetic, changing colors and logos, rather than functional improvements. A third client, Austin Manufacturing Solutions, learned that the inventory management system they'd been paying $5,000 monthly to maintain was running on a single shared server with dozens of other client systems. TechFlow had been billing each client for dedicated server resources while running all their applications on shared infrastructure that cost the company maybe $500 per month total. Each of these discoveries generated additional evidence of systematic fraud and provided investigators with more witnesses willing to testify about TechFlow's deceptive practices. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Kim, the former developer who'd been forced to resign after questioning HIPAA compliance, reached out to Amanda after hearing through industry contacts that TechFlow was under investigation. Sarah had kept copies of internal communications that revealed the full scope of the company's fraudulent activities. According to Sarah's documentation, TechFlow's business model was deliberately designed around systematic deception. The company would bid on projects using accurate cost estimates, then implement the projects using the cheapest possible methods, often relying on open-source solutions or outsourced development, while billing clients for custom work. Executives had regular meetings where they discussed strategies for maximizing profit margins through what they called efficiency optimization. In reality, these meetings were planning sessions for fraudulent billing practices. Sarah had recordings of several such meetings where Daniel Morrison, the CEO, explicitly instructed department heads to find ways to increase project margins regardless of client agreements. Even more damaging was Sarah's evidence of deliberate HIPAA violations. The company had been advised by multiple employees about the need for proper medical data security, but executives had consistently chosen to ignore these warnings to avoid the costs of compliance. Rebecca Walsh, the CFO, had even sent emails instructing IT staff to delay security upgrades that would have brought the company into HIPAA compliance. Armed with this additional evidence, federal investigators were able to obtain warrants for a comprehensive search of TechFlow's offices and electronic systems. The search was scheduled for Thursday morning, but they needed me to provide one final piece of evidence: a recorded conversation where company executives explicitly acknowledged their fraudulent practices. Agent Rodriguez briefed me on what she needed. During my meeting with Patricia on Monday, I was to accept the demotion offer but request a meeting with senior executives to discuss the transition. This meeting would provide an opportunity for executives to make incriminating statements about the company's practices while explaining why my original concerns had been dismissed. Friday morning arrived, and I walked into TechFlow's offices, knowing it would likely be my last day as an employee. But I also knew that by the end of the day, the entire executive team would be facing federal criminal charges. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main conference room. Present were Daniel Morrison, Rebecca Walsh, Tyler Brooks, Patricia Nguyen, and Linda Patterson. I was wearing recording equipment provided by the FBI, and Agent Rodriguez was monitoring the conversation from a van parked across the street. I started by formally accepting the demotion offer, thanking them for their patience and understanding. Then I asked for clarification about the issues I'd raised, claiming I wanted to learn from my mistakes to avoid similar problems in my new role. Daniel Morrison took the bait immediately. He launched into a condescending explanation of how the software industry really worked, describing the billing practices I'd questioned as standard optimization strategies. He explained that clients expected to pay premium prices for software development, and it was TechFlow's responsibility to deliver value while maintaining healthy profit margins. The reality, Marcus, is that clients don't want to know how the sausage is made, Morrison said, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. They want solutions that work, and they're willing to pay for expertise and reliability. Whether we build something from scratch or adapt existing solutions is irrelevant as long as the final product meets their needs. Rebecca Walsh added her own perspective on the billing practices, explaining that the company's success depended on maximizing efficiency while maintaining premium pricing. She described the overbilling I'd documented as value-based pricing, rather than fraud. But the most damaging statements came when I asked about the HIPAA violations. Tyler Brooks dismissed my concerns as overthinking compliance requirements and explained that the company had decided the costs of full compliance weren't justified by the relatively small healthcare segment of their business. Look, Marcus, Brooks said, HIPAA is more of a guideline than a hard requirement for companies like us. We're not a healthcare provider. We're a technology vendor. The compliance burden falls primarily on our clients, not on us. As long as we're not actively breaching security, we're operating within acceptable parameters. Linda Patterson, the legal representative, actually contradicted Brooks by explaining that his interpretation of HIPAA requirements was incorrect, but she was quickly cut off by Morrison, who insisted that the company's legal position had been thoroughly vetted. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, during which TechFlow's executives provided federal investigators with recorded admissions of systematic fraud, deliberate HIPAA violations, and conspiracy to defraud clients. They thought they were explaining their business practices to a defeated employee. In reality, they were confessing to federal crimes. As I left the building that afternoon, I received a text message from Amanda Foster. Perfect. Warrants executed at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Stay away from the office. That night, I barely slept. I knew that by morning, everything would change. TechFlow's executives had no idea that their entire criminal enterprise was about to collapse, taking their careers, their freedom, and their company with it. At 6 a.m. sharp, FBI agents executed search warrants at TechFlow's offices and the homes of all senior executives. The investigation that had started with my phone call to Jake Sullivan was about to expose one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in Austin's history. The dawn raid on TechFlow Solutions was executed with military precision. At exactly 6:02 a.m., FBI agents simultaneously entered the company's downtown Austin offices and the private residences of Daniel Morrison, Rebecca Walsh, Tyler Brooks, and Patricia Nguyen. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, coffee growing cold in my hands, as I saw federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from the building where I'd worked for nearly a year. Agent Rodriguez called me at 7:30 a.m. with an update. We've secured all electronic systems, financial records, and client files. Your documentation provided the roadmap we needed, but what we're finding goes far beyond what you originally discovered. This company was essentially a criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate business. The scope of TechFlow's fraudulent activities was staggering. Financial records seized during the raid revealed that the company had systematically overbilled clients by an estimated $4.2 million over the past 3 years. But the billing fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators discovered that TechFlow had been operating what amounted to a Ponzi scheme with their client contracts. The company would bid aggressively at low prices to win new contracts, then use revenue from those contracts to complete work on previously signed projects. This created a constant cash flow crisis that executives addressed by cutting corners, violating regulations, and engaging in increasingly desperate fraudulent practices. The HIPAA violations were even worse than I had documented. Federal investigators found evidence that TechFlow had been selling patient data to marketing companies, a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison. The company had disguised these transactions as anonymous analytics partnerships, but the data they were selling included enough personal information to easily identify individual patients. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Medicor was devastated when investigators informed her that her patient's medical records had been sold to at least 6 different marketing companies. "We trusted TechFlow to protect our patients' most sensitive information," she told reporters. "Instead, they turned our patients into commodities to be bought and sold." But the most shocking discovery came from Rebecca Walsh's personal laptop, which contained detailed financial records of kickback schemes with several vendors. TechFlow had been receiving payments from software companies in exchange for recommending their products to clients, without disclosing these financial relationships. In some cases, the company had deliberately recommended inferior products specifically because they provided higher kickback percentages. The evidence painted a picture of a company where corruption had infected every level of operations. Even junior employees who weren't aware of the larger criminal enterprise had been pressured to engage in questionable practices. The company's aggressive sales tactics, impossible project timelines, and constant pressure to maximize profits had created an environment where criminal behavior became normalized. By noon on Thursday, all 4 senior executives were in federal custody. Daniel Morrison was arrested at his $2.8 million mansion in Westlake Hills, where agents discovered a safe containing nearly $400,000 in cash and financial documents showing undeclared offshore accounts. Rebecca Walsh was taken into custody at Austin Bergstrom International Airport, apparently attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with 2 suitcases full of financial documents. Tyler Brooks and Patricia Nguyen were arrested at their respective homes without incident, though investigators found evidence that both had been preparing to destroy company records. Brooks had been in the process of formatting multiple hard drives when agents arrived, while Nguyen had been shredding personnel files that documented the company's systematic intimidation of whistleblowing employees. The arrests made headline news across Texas, but the story was far from over. Federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Thompson, announced that the investigation was expanding to include TechFlow's business partners, vendors, and potentially even some of their clients who may have been complicit in the fraudulent schemes. The impact on TechFlow's clients was immediate and devastating. Companies that had relied on TechFlow's software solutions suddenly found themselves without technical support and facing potential legal liability for privacy violations. Medicor was forced to shut down their patient portal and notify thousands of patients that their medical information had been compromised. Lone Star Capital faced regulatory scrutiny over their use of unlicensed trading software that had been misrepresented as a custom solution. But the most significant development came 3 days after the arrests, when Amanda Foster called me with news that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the case. "Marcus, we've been analyzing the financial records from Rebecca Walsh's laptop, and we've discovered something that makes this case much bigger than corporate fraud." TechFlow was being used to launder money for a network of companies involved in healthcare fraud across multiple states. The money laundering operation was sophisticated and had been running for at least 2 years. TechFlow would receive payments from shell companies that were defrauding Medicare and Medicaid programs, then use those funds to pay for legitimate-seeming software development contracts. The clean money would then be distributed back to the criminal network through various mechanisms, including the kickback schemes with vendors. This discovery elevated the case from corporate fraud to organized crime. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force took over the investigation, and agents began tracking financial connections between TechFlow and healthcare fraud schemes in California, Florida, and New York. The case that had started with my documentation of billing irregularities was now part of a federal investigation into a multi-state criminal conspiracy. The legal proceedings moved quickly once federal prosecutors understood the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Daniel Morrison was charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, HIPAA violations, money laundering, and racketeering. Rebecca Walsh faced similar charges, plus additional counts related to the attempted destruction of evidence and flight risk. Tyler Brooks and Patricia Nguyen were charged as co-conspirators and faced substantial prison sentences if convicted. But the prosecutors wanted more than just convictions. They wanted to dismantle the entire criminal network that had been using TechFlow as a money laundering operation. This meant they needed cooperation from the defendants, and they were willing to negotiate reduced sentences in exchange for information about the broader conspiracy. Rebecca Walsh was the first to break. Facing the possibility of life in prison, under federal racketeering statutes, she agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the full extent of TechFlow's role in the money laundering scheme and provided investigators with the information they needed to pursue the broader criminal network. According to Walsh's testimony, Daniel Morrison had been recruited by the criminal organization specifically because of his legitimate business background and technical expertise. The healthcare fraud network needed a way to process large amounts of money through apparently legitimate business transactions, and software development contracts provided the perfect cover. TechFlow's legitimate clients were unknowingly funding a criminal enterprise. The company would use revenue from honest contracts to pay for work on projects funded by criminal proceeds, effectively mixing clean and dirty money in ways that made the transactions appear legitimate to banking and regulatory oversight systems. Cooperation agreements led to a cascade of arrests across multiple states. In California, federal agents arrested the operators of 3 fake medical clinics that had been billing Medicare for services never provided. In Florida, authorities shut down a network of shell companies that had been submitting false claims for medical equipment. In New York, investigators uncovered a scheme where criminals were using stolen identities to create fake healthcare providers and submit fraudulent insurance claims. Each of these arrests generated additional evidence that pointed back to TechFlow's role as the central money laundering hub for the entire criminal network. What had started as my documentation of billing irregularities had uncovered one of the largest healthcare fraud conspiracies in federal law enforcement history. The media. Coverage was intense and unrelenting. Jake Sullivan, my journalist friend who had connected me with Amanda Foster, wrote a series of articles for the Austin Business Journal that won a state journalism award for investigative reporting. National news outlets picked up the story, and I found myself being interviewed by reporters from CNN, The Wall Street Journal, and 60 Minutes. The interviews were surreal. Just months earlier, I had been a quiet software engineer trying to do the right thing by reporting suspected fraud at my company. Now I was being hailed as a hero who had brought down a major criminal enterprise. The attention was overwhelming, but I felt obligated to tell the story because it illustrated how corporate crime could flourish when employees were too intimidated to speak up. During one particularly memorable interview with Anderson Cooper, he asked me what advice I would give to other employees who discovered evidence of corporate wrongdoing. My answer was simple. Document everything. Find allies you can trust, and remember that doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing. But the consequences of staying silent are always worse than the temporary discomfort of speaking up. The legal proceedings continued for 18 months, with trials, plea negotiations, and sentencing hearings that kept the story in the news. Daniel Morrison ultimately received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $8.4 million in restitution. Rebecca Walsh received 15 years after her cooperation agreement, while Tyler Brooks and Patricia Nguyen each received 8-year sentences. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't the prison sentences. It was the systematic dismantling of the criminal network that had been using TechFlow as their money laundering operation. Federal investigators ultimately arrested 47 individuals across 6 states and recovered more than $50 million in fraudulently obtained funds. The investigation led to enhanced oversight of software companies handling medical data and new regulations, requiring disclosure of vendor relationships in healthcare technology contracts. The civil lawsuits filed by TechFlow's defrauded clients resulted in additional financial penalties and established legal precedents that strengthened protection for corporate whistleblowers. Several of the company's former employees, inspired by the outcome of my case, came forward with evidence of additional wrongdoing that led to further criminal charges and civil penalties. As for me, the experience fundamentally changed my perspective on corporate responsibility and the importance of ethical leadership in the technology industry. The case had consumed nearly 2 years of my life, but it had also demonstrated that individual employees could make a difference when they found the courage to challenge powerful interests. The phone call that had started everything, my conversation with Jake Sullivan when I was facing TechFlow's ultimatum, had ultimately led to justice for thousands of victims and the dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years. But there was still one more chapter to this story, and it would prove that sometimes doing the right thing comes with rewards that go far beyond personal satisfaction. 6 months after the TechFlow executives were sentenced, I received a phone call that would change my life in ways I never could have anticipated. The caller was Victoria Chen, senior partner at Whitman & Associates, one of Austin's most prestigious law firms. Victoria specialized in whistleblower protection cases and had been following the TechFlow investigation from the beginning. "Marcus, I'd like to discuss something that might interest you. Are you familiar with the False Claims Act and its whistleblower provisions?" I wasn't, but Victoria's explanation opened my eyes to an aspect of the case I had never considered. Under federal law, individuals who report fraud against the government can receive a percentage of any money recovered through their whistleblowing efforts. Since TechFlow's money laundering operation had been used to process proceeds from Medicare and Medicaid fraud, my reporting had directly led to the recovery of federal funds. The numbers were staggering. Federal investigators had traced $23.7 million in fraudulently obtained Medicare and Medicaid payments that had been laundered through TechFlow's operations. Under the False Claims Act, I was entitled to between 15% and 30% of the recovered amount, depending on various factors, including my cooperation with the investigation and the significance of my contribution to the case. Victoria filed the necessary paperwork with the Department of Justice, and 8 months later, I received a check for $4.2 million as my whistleblower reward. The financial security was life-changing, but more importantly, it validated the decision I had made to speak up despite the personal and professional risks. The money gave me the freedom to pursue opportunities I had never imagined possible. But before I could focus on my own future, there were still people who needed help dealing with the aftermath of TechFlow's criminal activities. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Medicor had become a friend during the investigation. Her startup had been devastated by the data breaches and HIPAA violations, and despite receiving settlements from various insurance claims, the company was struggling to rebuild trust with patients and investors. When she approached me about consulting on their data security overhaul, I saw an opportunity to use my experience for something constructive. Working with Medicor's team, I helped design and implement security protocols that exceeded industry standards. We created systems that not only protected patient data, but also provided transparency tools that allowed patients to see exactly how their information was being used and protected. The project took 8 months and resulted in Medicor becoming a model for healthcare data security practices. Word of my work with Medicor spread quickly through Austin's tech community. Other companies that had been affected by TechFlow's fraud began reaching out for help with their own security and compliance challenges. Within a year, I had inadvertently started a consulting business specializing in ethical technology practices and corporate compliance. But the most rewarding projects came from an unexpected source. Several former TechFlow employees who had been terminated or forced to resign for raising ethical concerns reached out to me for help. These individuals had been blacklisted by other companies in Austin's tech sector, their careers damaged by their association with TechFlow, despite being victims rather than perpetrators. Sarah Kim, the former developer who had provided crucial evidence for the federal investigation, had been unemployed for over a year. Despite her role in exposing TechFlow's crimes, potential employers were wary of hiring someone associated with such a high-profile fraud case. I hired Sarah as my first full-time employee and helped her rebuild her professional reputation. David Martinez, another former TechFlow employee who had been fired for questioning billing practices, had started driving for a rideshare company to make ends meet despite having 15 years of software development experience. He became my second hire, and within 6 months, he was leading security audits for healthcare technology companies across Texas. By the end of 2025, Chen Security Solutions had grown to 12 employees, all of whom were either former TechFlow employees who had been retaliated against for ethical behavior, or developers who shared our commitment to transparent and ethical business practices. We had become known throughout the tech industry not just for our technical expertise, but for our absolute commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. The success of the consulting business created opportunities I had never considered. Stanford University's Business School invited me to speak at their annual ethics conference. Harvard Law School asked me to participate in a panel discussion about corporate whistleblowing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation invited me to help develop training materials for agents investigating corporate fraud cases. Each speaking engagement reinforced the same message. Corporate crime flourishes in environments where employees are afraid to speak up, and creating ethical business cultures requires leadership that encourages and protects those who raise concerns. The TechFlow case had become a textbook example of how individual courage can expose and dismantle even sophisticated criminal enterprises. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Department of Health and Human Services presented me with their Inspector General's Award for Integrity, recognizing my role in protecting healthcare consumers and preserving the integrity of federal healthcare programs. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., and attending were several of the Medicorps patients whose medical records had been protected as a result of the investigation. Meeting those patients was emotional and humbling. One woman, Maria Rodriguez, told me that discovering her medical records had been sold to marketing companies had made her afraid to seek treatment for a chronic condition. Knowing that someone was willing to fight for patients they had never met gave me hope that there are still people who care about doing the right thing, she said. These interactions reminded me that the TechFlow case wasn't just about corporate fraud or financial crimes. It was about real people whose lives had been affected by the actions of executives who prioritized profits over human dignity and legal obligations. The media attention continued for years after the initial arrests. My story was featured in a documentary about corporate whistleblowing that won an Emmy Award for investigative journalism. A book about the case, written by investigative reporter Amanda Foster, became a bestseller and was optioned for a movie adaptation. I was invited to testify before congressional committees examining healthcare fraud and corporate accountability. But the most satisfying developments were the systemic changes that resulted from the investigation. Congress passed the Healthcare Technology Accountability Act, which strengthened penalties for HIPAA violations and required enhanced disclosure of vendor relationships in healthcare technology contracts. The Department of Justice created specialized task forces focused on technology companies that handle sensitive data, and the FBI established new protocols for investigating complex corporate fraud cases. Professional organizations in the software development industry updated their ethical guidelines and created new whistleblower protection programs. Several major technology companies implemented anonymous reporting systems specifically designed to encourage employees to report suspected fraud or compliance violations without fear of retaliation. The Austin tech community, which had been shaken by the TechFlow scandal, emerged stronger and more committed to ethical business practices. Local organizations created mentorship programs pairing experienced developers with young professionals, emphasizing not just technical skills, but also ethical decision-making and professional integrity. 3 years after walking into Patricia Goyen's office and being told to accept a 70% pay cut or leave, I found myself addressing a conference of 500 technology executives about the importance of ethical leadership in corporate culture. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had tried to silence me had inadvertently launched a career built on speaking truth to power. During that conference, I shared a story that had become central to my speaking engagements. I talked about the moment when I sat in my apartment, staring at TechFlow's ultimatum, and had to choose between financial security and moral integrity. I explained how making that phone call to Jake Sullivan had seemed like a small act at the time, but had ultimately led to justice for thousands of victims and systematic changes that would protect future victims. Every employee in every company will face moments when they have to choose between what's easy and what's right, I told the audience. The TechFlow case proved that individual actions can have consequences far beyond what we imagine. But those consequences only materialize when people find the courage to act on their convictions. The response was overwhelming. After the presentation, dozens of executives approached me with stories of ethical challenges in their own organizations. Some described situations where they suspected fraud, but weren't sure how to proceed. Others talked about creating corporate cultures that encouraged ethical behavior and protected employees who raised concerns. These conversations reinforced my belief that the TechFlow case represented something larger than just one company's criminal behavior. It highlighted the critical importance of individual integrity in maintaining ethical business practices and protecting the public interest. As I reflected on the journey from that Tuesday morning when HR delivered their ultimatum to becoming a nationally recognized advocate for corporate ethics, I realized that TechFlow's executives had made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that threatening my livelihood would be enough to silence me, but they failed to understand that some principles are worth more than job security. The phone call that started everything, my conversation with Jake Sullivan when I was facing an impossible choice, had transformed not just my own life but the lives of countless others who had been victimized by corporate fraud. It had led to criminal convictions, regulatory changes, and a new awareness of the importance of protecting whistleblowers who risk everything to expose wrongdoing. But as satisfying as the outcomes had been, I knew that the work of promoting ethical business practices was far from finished. Corporate crime continues to evolve, and new challenges emerge as technology creates new opportunities for both innovation and exploitation. The final chapter of the TechFlow story wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about using the platform that had emerged from the case to help build a business culture where integrity matters more than profit margins, where employees feel empowered to speak up about wrongdoing, and where doing the right thing is recognized and rewarded rather than punished. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it required the efforts of many people beyond just one software engineer who refused to accept an unethical ultimatum. But it proved that individual courage, combined with the right support systems and legal protections, could create changes that extend far beyond any single case or company. The story that had started with corporate bullying had become a testament to the power of individual integrity and the importance of never underestimating what one person can accomplish when they refuse to be silenced. 7 years after TechFlow Solutions was shuttered, I received a call that would bring me face to face with the ghosts of that corporate nightmare one final time. The caller was Agent Christina Rodriguez, now promoted to special agent in charge of the FBI's Austin office. "Marcus, we need to talk. Daniel Morrison is being released from federal prison next month, and our intelligence suggests he's planning something that involves you directly." The news hit me like a physical blow. Morrison had been serving a 25-year sentence, but apparently, his cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into healthcare fraud networks had earned him a significant reduction in his prison term. What was more disturbing was the intelligence agent Rodriguez had gathered about his post-release activities. Morrison had spent his time in federal prison networking with other white-collar criminals and had apparently become obsessed with what he viewed as the destruction of his life and reputation. According to intercepted communications, he blamed me personally for not just his conviction, but for the broader crackdown on corporate fraud that had made his particular style of criminal enterprise much more difficult to operate. He's been in contact with several individuals who have grudges against corporate whistleblowers, Rodriguez explained during our meeting at the FBI field office. "We believe he's organizing some kind of retaliation campaign, not just against you, but against the entire system of corporate accountability that emerged from the TechFlow case." The threat was both personal and professional. Morrison had apparently spent years studying every aspect of my post-TechFlow career, from Chen security solutions to my academic work to my consulting relationships with major corporations. He had developed detailed plans to systematically destroy my reputation and business through a campaign of disinformation, legal harassment, and potentially violent intimidation. But Morrison's plans went beyond just targeting me. He had connected with other convicted corporate criminals who shared his resentment about the enhanced enforcement environment that had emerged since the TechFlow case. Together, they were planning what law enforcement officials described as a counter-whistleblowing campaign designed to discourage employees from reporting corporate wrongdoing. The scope of Morrison's network was troubling. He had established relationships with corrupt business consultants, disgraced former executives, and even some legitimate businesses that viewed enhanced corporate oversight as a threat to their profits. The group was planning to use sophisticated disinformation techniques to undermine public trust in corporate whistleblowing and to personally destroy individuals who had gained prominence for exposing corporate crimes. Agent Rodriguez showed me evidence of Morrison's activities that was both impressive and terrifying in its sophistication. He had created fake social media profiles, established shell companies to fund his operations, and even hired private investigators to gather compromising information about corporate ethics advocates and federal prosecutors who had been involved in high-profile fraud cases. "This isn't just about revenge," Rodriguez explained. "Morrison believes that if he can discredit you and a few other prominent whistleblowers, he can create enough doubt about corporate accountability initiatives to roll back many of the reforms that were implemented after your case." The FBI wanted my cooperation in an undercover operation designed to expose Morrison's network and gather evidence of their planned criminal activities. The operation would require me to allow Morrison to make contact and attempt to draw him into making incriminating statements about his plans. The decision to participate was difficult. I had built a successful life and career in the years since TechFlow, and deliberately walking back into that world of corporate crime and personal danger felt like an unnecessary risk. But Agent Rodriguez's briefing made it clear that Morrison's plans posed a threat not just to me, but to the entire system of protections and accountability measures that had emerged from corporate fraud cases across the country. More importantly, I realized that refusing to confront Morrison would mean abandoning the principles that had guided my decisions throughout the TechFlow case. If I wasn't willing to take risks to protect the systems that protected other whistleblowers, then all the work of the past 7 years would be meaningless. The undercover operation began 3 weeks before Morrison's scheduled release. FBI agents had learned that he planned to contact me through intermediaries, presenting himself as a reformed businessman interested in funding corporate ethics initiatives. His real plan was to get close enough to my operations to gather intelligence that could be used to destroy my credibility and business. The first contact came through Elizabeth Warren, a business consultant who claimed to represent an investment group interested in expanding Chen Security Solutions into international markets. Elizabeth was professional, knowledgeable, and convincing. Exactly the kind of potential partner that could help take my business to the next level. But something about her approach felt wrong. Her questions were too specific about my personal, financial situation, too focused on my relationships with federal law enforcement, and too interested in the details of how I had gathered evidence during the TechFlow investigation. When I ran background checks on her supposed investment group, I discovered that the company existed only on paper and had been created just weeks before she contacted me. Working with the FBI, I agreed to meet with Elizabeth and her associates, including someone she described as a former technology executive with experience in corporate restructuring. I suspected this would be Morrison, but I was still unprepared for the emotional impact of seeing him again after 7 years. Morrison had aged considerably during his time in prison. The arrogant, well-dressed executive I remembered had been replaced by a thinner, grayer man whose eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there before. But his voice was the same, and hearing him speak brought back vivid memories of that final meeting where TechFlow's executives had confidently confessed to their crimes, never imagining that their words were being recorded by federal investigators. The meeting took place in a downtown Austin restaurant, with FBI agents monitoring from nearby tables and recording equipment hidden in my clothing. Morrison introduced himself as David Miller, but his mannerisms and speech patterns were unmistakable. "Marcus, I've been following your work since the TechFlow situation," he said, leaning forward with what he probably thought was a friendly smile. That was a challenging time for everyone involved, but I think there were lessons learned on all sides. His approach was sophisticated and manipulative. Rather than expressing obvious hostility, he positioned himself as someone who had gained wisdom from his experiences and wanted to contribute to positive change in corporate culture. He spoke about the importance of balancing accountability with business efficiency, about the need to protect legitimate business practices from overzealous enforcement, and about his desire to fund initiatives that would promote reasonable approaches to corporate ethics. But as the conversation continued, Morrison's real agenda became clear. He wanted detailed information about my sources of evidence during the TechFlow investigation, my relationships with federal agencies, and my methods for detecting corporate fraud. He was particularly interested in learning about other whistleblowers I had worked with and the specific techniques they had used to gather evidence. The conversation lasted 2 hours, during which Morrison gradually revealed the scope of his planned retaliation campaign. He described a network of reformed business leaders who were committed to restoring balance to corporate oversight. He talked about media campaigns designed to highlight cases where whistleblowing had allegedly damaged innocent companies, legal challenges to federal regulations that had been implemented after major fraud cases, and targeted harassment of individuals who had gained prominence for exposing corporate wrongdoing. Most disturbingly, Morrison hinted at more direct forms of retaliation. He mentioned private investigators who could uncover embarrassing personal information about corporate ethics advocates, business relationships that could be disrupted through legal challenges and intimidation, and even physical surveillance and harassment designed to make targets feel unsafe. "The problem with people like you, Marcus," Morrison said toward the end of our meeting, "is that you don't understand the broader consequences of your actions. When you destroy companies like TechFlow, you're not just hurting a few executives. You're damaging entire industries and making it harder for legitimate businesses to operate efficiently." He went on to explain his belief that corporate fraud prosecutions had gone too far, that federal agencies had become overzealous in their enforcement efforts, and that the pendulum needed to swing back toward business-friendly policies. His plan was to use targeted attacks on prominent whistleblowers to create a narrative that corporate accountability initiatives were being driven by disgruntled employees and ambitious prosecutors rather than legitimate concerns about criminal behavior. The recording of that conversation provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to charge Morrison and his associates with conspiracy, intimidation of federal witnesses, and violations of various laws protecting corporate whistleblowers. But the investigation revealed something even more troubling than Morrison's personal vendetta. His network included several active business executives who were using their positions to identify and target employees who might be inclined to report corporate wrongdoing. These executives had developed sophisticated systems for monitoring employee communications, identifying potential whistleblowers, and either co-opting or neutralizing them before they could expose criminal activities. The scope of this counterintelligence operation against corporate accountability was staggering. Morrison's associates had infiltrated ethics training programs, corrupted anonymous reporting systems, and even placed agents in government agencies responsible for investigating corporate fraud. The federal response was swift and comprehensive. Within weeks of Morrison's recorded confession, FBI agents executed search warrants at dozens of locations across multiple states. The investigation ultimately led to criminal charges against 34 individuals and exposed a systematic effort to undermine corporate accountability measures that had cost businesses millions of dollars and endangered countless employees who had tried to report wrongdoing. Morrison was returned to federal prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence, plus additional time for the new charges. But more importantly, the exposure of his network led to enhanced protections for whistleblowers and new federal programs designed to identify and counter organized efforts to intimidate corporate accountability advocates. The final confrontation with Morrison had been both personally satisfying and professionally validating. It demonstrated that the decision to refuse TechFlow's ultimatum 7 years earlier had been about more than just one case or one company. It had been about choosing to stand on the side of accountability and transparency in a business culture that often rewards the opposite values. As I watched the news coverage of Morrison's arrest and the dismantling of his retaliation network, I realized that the TechFlow story had come full circle. The executives who had tried to silence me with threats and intimidation had ultimately provided me with the opportunity to protect countless other employees who would face similar choices in the future. The phone call that had started everything. Not that conversation with Jake Sullivan when I was facing an impossible ultimatum, had led not just to justice in one case, but to systemic changes that would continue protecting people long after I was gone. Morrison's failed attempt at revenge had only reinforced the importance of those protections and the courage required to maintain them. 10 years after that fateful Tuesday morning when Patricia Nguyen told me to accept a 70% pay cut or leave, I found myself standing in the same downtown Austin building where TechFlow Solutions once operated. But this time, I wasn't there as a defeated employee facing an impossible choice. I was there as the keynote speaker for the inaugural Austin Corporate Ethics Summit, an event that had grown directly out of the changes sparked by my refusal to stay silent. The building had been completely renovated since TechFlow's collapse. Where Daniel Morrison's corner office once overlooked the city, there was now a conference room dedicated to ethics training. The space where Rebecca Walsh had managed fraudulent billing schemes had become a resource center for employees reporting corporate wrongdoing. Even the small conference room where I'd been given my ultimatum was now part of a nonprofit organization that provided legal support for corporate whistleblowers. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who knew the building's history. Austin's business community had deliberately chosen this location to host their annual ethics summit as a reminder of how quickly corporate crime could destroy even successful companies, and how individual courage could create lasting positive change. Standing at the podium where I would address 800 business leaders, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared software engineer who had once sat in this very building, staring at an ultimatum that seemed designed to destroy his career, had somehow become one of the most recognizable voices in corporate ethics and accountability. But the real measure of success wasn't my personal transformation. It was the fundamental change in how American businesses approached ethical decision-making. The statistics presented at the summit were remarkable. Corporate whistleblowing reports had increased by 340% since the TechFlow case. Federal fraud prosecutions had more than doubled. And most importantly, surveys showed that employees felt significantly more confident about reporting suspected wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. Chen Security Solutions had grown into a multinational consulting firm with offices in 12 countries. We employed over 200 people, most of whom were former whistleblowers or ethics advocates who had found their calling in helping organizations build cultures of accountability. Our client list included 60% of Fortune 500 companies, and our training programs had reached over 100,000 employees worldwide. The academic work had expanded as well. The Chen Institute for Corporate Ethics at Stanford University had become the leading research center for studying organizational integrity and whistleblower protection. Our studies had influenced legislation in 15 countries and had provided the empirical foundation for new international standards on corporate accountability. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the network of relationships that had emerged from the original case. Sarah Kim, the former TechFlow developer who had provided crucial evidence, was now the chief ethics officer at a major technology company. David Martinez had started his own consulting firm specializing in fraud detection. Jennifer Wu, the financial analyst who had exposed securities fraud using techniques developed from our work, had become a federal prosecutor specializing in corporate crime. Dozens of other individuals whose lives had been touched by the TechFlow case had gone on to careers dedicated to promoting corporate integrity. They had become the next generation of ethics advocates, carrying forward the lessons learned from that original investigation and applying them to new challenges in an evolving business environment. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual careers. The Corporate Accountability Enhancement Act had been strengthened twice since its original passage, each time based on lessons learned from new cases that had emerged from the enhanced reporting environment. Federal agencies had created specialized units for investigating corporate fraud, and prosecutors had developed new techniques for building cases against sophisticated criminal enterprises. International organizations had adopted similar reforms. The United Nations had created new standards for corporate transparency based partly on research emerging from the TechFlow case. The World Bank had implemented enhanced due diligence requirements for companies seeking development funding. Even the European Union had strengthened their corporate accountability regulations, citing American innovations in whistleblower protection as a model for their own reforms. During my keynote address, I shared stories that had never been made public. Before, conversations with victims whose lives had been changed by corporate fraud, interactions with executives who had found the courage to transform their organizational cultures, and moments of doubt when the personal costs of advocacy had seemed overwhelming. I talked about Maria Rodriguez, the Medicare patient whose medical privacy had been violated, and how she had become an advocate for healthcare data protection. I described meetings with congressional leaders who had initially been skeptical about enhanced corporate oversight, but had become champions of accountability measures after seeing the evidence from cases like TechFlow. Most importantly, I addressed the question that was asked most frequently during my speaking engagements: what would you tell someone who discovers evidence of corporate wrongdoing but is afraid to speak up? My answer had evolved over the years, but the core message remained consistent. The choice you're facing isn't really between financial security and doing the right thing. It's between temporary safety and long-term integrity. The TechFlow case proved that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing doesn't actually protect you. It just ensures that the problems will get worse until they eventually destroy everything anyway. I explained that the protection systems now in place meant that employees who reported corporate wrongdoing were significantly safer than they had been 10 years earlier. Federal whistleblower laws had been strengthened, legal resources were more readily available, and public attitudes toward corporate accountability had shifted dramatically. But more than that, I emphasized that individual acts of courage created opportunities that extended far beyond personal benefit. Every person who chose to speak up about corporate wrongdoing was contributing to a culture where ethical behavior was valued and protected, making it easier for the next person to make similar choices. The response to the keynote was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, several executives shared stories of ethical challenges they had faced and how the TechFlow case had influenced their decision-making. One CEO described how reading about my experience had given her the courage to fire a senior executive who had been engaging in questionable accounting practices. Another talked about implementing comprehensive ethics training programs, specifically because he didn't want his company to become the next cautionary tale. But the most moving moment came when a young software engineer named Alex Kim approached me after the presentation. Alex worked for a startup that was developing medical devices, and he had discovered that the company was manipulating safety testing data to accelerate their product approval process. 6 months ago, I would have been too scared to report this, Alex told me. But knowing your story and understanding that there are systems in place to protect people like me, gave me the confidence to contact the FDA. The investigation is still ongoing, but I know I did the right thing. Alex's story represented the ultimate validation of everything that had emerged from the TechFlow case. The scared software engineer who had once faced an impossible choice had somehow created an environment where other employees felt empowered to make similar choices with confidence and support. That evening, as I drove home from the summit, I passed the building where TechFlow Solutions had once operated. The lights were on in the Ethics Training Center, where a group of employees from a local technology company were participating in a workshop on identifying and reporting corporate fraud. I thought about the phone call that had started everything. That conversation with Jake Sullivan when I was sitting in my apartment, staring at Patricia Nguyen's ultimatum, feeling like I had no good options. That single decision to reach out for help had ultimately led to this moment, where hundreds of people were learning how to protect themselves and their organizations from the kind of criminal behavior that had once seemed unstoppable. The executives at TechFlow Solutions had made a fundamental miscalculation when they tried to intimidate me into silence. They assumed that threatening my livelihood would be enough to make me compliant, but they failed to understand that some principles are worth more than job security. Their attempts at intimidation had backfired spectacularly, creating not just one advocate for corporate accountability, but an entire movement dedicated to protecting employees who choose courage over comfort. The company they had built to enrich themselves through criminal activity had become the foundation for systems that would protect countless others from similar exploitation. As I reflected on the journey from that impossible choice to this moment of triumph, I realized that the TechFlow story wasn't really about corporate fraud or whistleblowing or even justice. It was about the power of individual integrity to create changes that extend far beyond anything one person could accomplish alone. The phone call that had seemed so risky at the time had proven to be the most important decision of my life. It had demonstrated that doing the right thing, even when it seems impossible or futile, can create opportunities and outcomes that exceed our wildest imagination. 10 years later, the choice was clear. Accepting TechFlow's ultimatum would have meant temporary financial stability but permanent moral compromise. Refusing their demands had led to temporary uncertainty, but lasting integrity, meaningful work, and the knowledge that one person's courage could inspire thousands of others to stand up for what's right. The victory wasn't just personal. It was proof that in the eternal struggle between corruption and accountability, between fear and courage, between silence and truth, the right choice always creates possibilities that the wrong choice can never match. That realization, more than any financial reward or professional recognition, represented the true triumph over the executives who had once tried to silence me with threats and intimidation. They had lost everything, while the principles they had tried to destroy had grown stronger than ever. The phone call that changed everything had become a testament to the power of individual integrity and a reminder that sometimes the most important victories begin with the simplest act of refusing to be silenced. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.